In the medieval world, inheritance was not just a matter of family, it was the foundation of power, survival, and identity. Everything revolved around land. Land fed families, funded armies, defined social rank, and even determined one's place in heaven. Whoever controlled the land controlled the people, and whoever inherited it inherited the world. When a landowner died, everything he owned, his fields, livestock, servants, and even debts, had to pass to someone. But the rules that governed this transfer were far from simple or fair. Inheritance laws were a maze of tradition, superstition, and power politics. What was written in a will could be overturned by a priest's word, a king's favor, or a forged seal. What was promised by blood could be stolen by paper. The medieval obsession with inheritance stemmed from fear of losing status, fear of extinction, and fear of damnation. Without a rightful heir, a family's name could vanish forever. To die without issue was to die twice, once in body, once in memory. That's why marriages were strategic, children were counted like assets, and birth order became destiny. The moment a son was born, his future, and the fate of the estate, was already decided. But inheritance was rarely peaceful. The death of a noble or wealthy landholder often triggered chaos. Claims and counterclaims flooded the manorial courts. Brothers turned on each other, cousins disputed bloodlines, widows fought for dowries. Even the church and the crown would intervene, eager to seize a share of what was left behind. The line between rightful inheritance and sanctioned theft was paper thin. For the church, inheritance was both a moral test and a source of immense profit. Priests preached that the path to salvation lay in generosity, especially towards the church itself. Countless nobles, terrified of eternal punishment, donated lands to monasteries for the good of their souls. In doing so, they robbed their heirs, enriching the clergy and tightening the church's grip over Europe's land. By the 12th century, nearly one-third of all arable land in some regions of France and England belonged to the church. Kings, meanwhile, manipulated inheritance to keep nobles loyal. A disputed will was an opportunity. A crown could confirm one heir and deny another, strengthening alliances or destroying enemies without lifting a sword. Monarchs used inheritance rights as currency, rewarding obedience, punishing rebellion. Feudal law made every piece of land traceable upward to the king, ensuring that all wealth ultimately flowed back to the throne. Peasants faced the same struggles on a smaller scale. Even a few acres or a single cow could divide families for generations. In many villages, inheritance was determined not by law but by custom. A father's death might see his land split among sons, or sometimes taken entirely by the local lord. Daughters were often excluded, except in desperate cases, and widows could lose everything overnight if no male heir existed. To modern minds, it may seem strange that entire wars could be fought over parchment and seals, but in the medieval world, a written claim to land was a claim to life itself. Inheritance disputes could ignite decades of violence, reshaping borders and destroying dynasties. Behind every castle siege and royal marriage lurked the same cold motive: the right to inherit. The medieval man lived and died by the land, and every law, custom, and belief system reflected that truth. To inherit was to continue. To be disinherited was to vanish. Blood, loyalty, and property became indistinguishable. In this world, lineage wasn't just a matter of pride. It was the only form of immortality most people could ever hope for. And so, generation after generation, Europe bled over parchment and soil. The laws of inheritance weren't written merely to preserve order. They were designed to decide who would rule, who would serve, and who would disappear. At the heart of medieval inheritance lay one brutal, simple rule. The firstborn son inherited everything. This system, known as primogeniture, shaped Europe's families, politics, and wars for centuries. It was designed to preserve wealth and power, to keep estates intact rather than divided. But it also created generations of bitterness, betrayal, and rebellion within bloodlines. The logic seemed practical. If a lord divided his lands among all his sons, within a few generations his estate would crumble into a patchwork of useless fragments. A single heir ensured stability. The manor, the castle, the title, all passed to one hand. The others were left with nothing but their names. And so the eldest son was trained from childhood to rule, while his brothers were quietly pushed aside, sent to the church, to war, or into service under other nobles. For younger sons, primogeniture was both a curse and a challenge. Stripped of land, they sought fortune elsewhere. Some became mercenaries, fighting for foreign kings. Others joined monasteries, exchanging inheritance for salvation. Many were forced into marriage alliances that offered status without wealth. Across Europe, thousands of younger sons carried noble blood but lived as wanderers, disinherited ghosts of families that had chosen efficiency over kinship. The policy of primogeniture also shaped the landscape of medieval ambition. It produced knights who fought not for land but for glory, desperate to carve their own place in history. It filled crusader armies with landless nobles who saw the Holy Land as their last chance at fortune. It even fueled internal wars, as younger siblings raised armies to challenge the inheritance system itself. Behind every rebellion, there was often a disinherited heir seeking justice or vengeance. But not all lands followed this rule. In regions like Normandy and England, primogeniture dominated. In parts of Germany and Scandinavia, partible inheritance, dividing land among all sons, still held sway. These competing systems defined the map of Europe. Where land was divided, kingdoms fractured. Where it was not, dynasties grew strong but cruel. No matter the system, the outcome was the same. Family bonds were tested by the weight of property. Women, too, were victims of this system. Daughters were almost always excluded from inheritance, unless no male heir existed. Even then, they inherited conditionally, often forced into marriage with a man chosen by her father's liege lord or the king himself. Through these women, estates could shift ownership entirely, absorbed into another family's domain. Inheritance became less a birthright than a bargaining chip in political games. And when a firstborn son died without an heir, chaos followed. Every relative, near or distant, might claim the estate. The crown would often step in, seizing the lands temporarily for safekeeping, a polite form of confiscation. Legal disputes dragged on for decades, draining fortunes and destroying families. Inheritance law was supposed to ensure continuity. Instead, it ensured conflict. By the 13th century, primogeniture was not just a law, it was a philosophy. It shaped medieval hierarchy from the throne to the village. The eldest son represented order, authority, and divine will. To challenge that was to challenge the social fabric itself. Yet beneath this rigid structure brewed a quiet rage, the kind of resentment that would, in time, topple feudalism and redefine the meaning of justice. The system guaranteed the survival of estates, but sacrificed generations of brothers, daughters, and widows in the process. Land remained stable, but hearts were not. The medieval obsession with inheritance created the illusion of control, while beneath it, Europe smoldered with envy, ambition, and blood. Medieval inheritance was built upon one principle: blood decides all. Yet not all blood was valued equally. In the eyes of the law, not every child born to a nobleman, or even to a king, was considered legitimate. And if you were born the wrong gender or the wrong way, the law would not just deny you wealth, it would erase you from history. In most of medieval Europe, daughters stood at the bottom of the inheritance ladder. Their worth lay not in ownership, but in marriage. A daughter could not inherit her father's lands if a son existed, no matter how unfit or cruel he might be. Her dowry was considered her share, a portion of her father's fortune exchanged for obedience and alliance. The moment she married, her name and rights passed to her husband. In legal terms, she ceased to exist as an individual. But when no sons were born, inheritance became a game of desperation and manipulation. Kings and nobles would rush to marry off heiresses to trusted allies, or more often, to men ambitious enough to seize power through them. Through these women, dynasties rose and fell. England's War of the Roses, Aquitaine's transfer to the English crown, and countless border conflicts were born from marriages where the woman carried the land, but the man claimed the authority. If daughters were trapped by law, illegitimate sons were trapped by shame. Bastards, children born outside wedlock, were considered tainted by sin, no matter who their parents were. Even the blood of kings could not save them. The Church decreed that legitimacy came only through sanctified marriage, and secular law followed suit. A noble's bastard son might share his father's courage, intellect, and loyalty, but in the eyes of the law, he was invisible. Still, bastards filled Europe's castles and courts, moving like shadows between privilege and exile. Some were acknowledged, raised in secret, or granted minor titles. Others were abandoned entirely, left to carve their own path with the only weapon they had, their name. Ironically, many proved more ambitious and capable than their lawful half-brothers. Some became generals, bishops, or founders of new lineages. One of history's most famous bastards, William the Conqueror, rose from illegitimacy to reshape England forever. His rule was both proof and paradox. A bastard could conquer the world, but he could never fully escape the stain of his birth. The Church's influence made inheritance a matter of both blood and morality. A legitimate child was not just born of lawful marriage, he was born of divine approval. That gave the clergy enormous power to define who was and wasn't an heir. A single priest's testimony could make or unmake a dynasty. Documents could be forged, witnesses bribed, and marriages invalidated after death, all in the name of righteousness. This system created moral contradictions so deep they tore families apart. Men were forced to publicly disown children they privately adored. Women were condemned for bearing sons to men who promised love, but not vows. And yet, the world still revolved around the same obsession: preserving pure bloodlines. In a society where family meant survival, purity became more important than justice. For those left outside the law, the daughters, the widows, the bastards, there were only two paths: submission or defiance. Some accepted their fates quietly, retreating into convents or second marriages. Others fought back through wit and cunning, seeking alliances, forging documents, even starting wars to claim what was theirs by blood, if not by law. Every medieval castle held such stories. A daughter denied her father's estate, a bastard son forced to flee, a widow outmaneuvered by her in-laws. The law claimed to honor lineage, but in practice it destroyed it. Beneath the grandeur of heraldry and noble titles lay a truth Europe never dared to say aloud. The law of inheritance was never about justice. It was about control. In medieval Europe, death was not the end of life. It was the beginning of ownership. When a man died, his soul belonged to God, but his land belonged to someone else. And in this brutal tug-of-war between heaven and earth, two powers fought for control: the church and the crown. Together they turned inheritance into a battlefield of faith, politics, and greed. The church, clothed in sanctity, understood the terror of the dying man better than anyone. To the medieval mind, death meant judgment, and judgment meant fear. Priests visited nobles on their deathbeds, whispering promises of salvation in exchange for gifts of land, gold, or livestock. These donations for the soul filled monasteries with wealth. A man could sin for a lifetime, yet by giving his estate to God at the end, he hoped to buy eternal rest. The church, ever pragmatic, accepted both his guilt and his property. Over time, this practice transformed religion into one of the largest landowners in Europe. By the 13th century, entire regions were under clerical control. In England alone, the church held roughly 1/3 of all arable land. Abbeys became self-sustaining empires, fortresses of prayer and profit. Each new donation strengthened the church's grip over kingdoms and weakened the nobilities. When land was transferred to God, it vanished from secular law forever. No heir, no king, no rival could reclaim it. The crown saw this as both blasphemy and theft. Every acre given to the church was one less under royal taxation, one less army to command. Kings began to strike back, not out of faith, but out of fear of losing control. Monarchs passed laws restricting donations, forcing the clergy to pay taxes on church lands. But the church always found a way around them. They could claim spiritual exemption, argue divine right, or simply hide property behind complex legal charters. The king ruled over bodies, but the church ruled over souls, and the dead had no defense. Inheritance thus became a weapon in the silent war between the throne and the altar. A loyal noble's death could enrich the crown or the church, depending on who reached his bedside first. Priests wielded quills like daggers, drafting wills that favored heaven. Royal clerks countered with seals that bound estates to royal law. Every signature was a battle line, every will a victory or defeat. For ordinary families, this rivalry was devastating. When a father's estate passed to the church, his widow and children were often left destitute. The church claimed the land was given freely, though few dared to argue with the priests of salvation. Those who resisted were branded ungrateful or heretical. Yet desperation sometimes drove heirs to violence, raiding monasteries, burning records, or assassinating clerics who had stolen their inheritance. Even kings weren't immune. When powerful rulers died, their wills were examined like holy relics. A single clause could alter the balance of Europe. In some cases, popes personally intervened, declaring royal testaments invalid if they threatened church interests. Kings learned to die carefully, often surrounded by both priests and lawyers, each waiting to claim their portion of the corpse. But perhaps the most chilling truth was this: the church's hold over inheritance outlasted life itself. Even after death, families were pressured to continue donations in the name of the deceased, to ensure prayers for their souls. The dead became debtors to eternity. The church's wealth grew not through conquest, but through fear, the quiet fear of the dying and the desperate hope of their survivors. By the late Middle Ages, both church and crown understood that control over inheritance meant control over the living. Every birth, every marriage, every death was registered through their hands. The land was no longer merely soil. It was the currency of divine and royal power. And the question was no longer who inherits, but rather, who dares to claim what the dead once owned? Not every land followed the harsh logic of the firstborn. In large parts of continental Europe, Germany, Scandinavia, parts of France and Italy, a different system ruled inheritance, partible succession. It was a vision of fairness that divided a man's estate equally among his sons. But what began as an act of justice soon became a curse that fractured kingdoms, ruined dynasties, and turned brothers into rivals. The idea seemed noble. Each son, after all, shared the same blood and should share the same inheritance. No child was left destitute. Every branch of the family had a place in the world. Yet as centuries passed, this ideal of equality eroded stability. A single lord's death could shatter his holdings into a dozen pieces. Once great estates splintered into fragments too small to feed the families that owned them. The drive to preserve fairness destroyed the very power it was meant to protect. Nowhere was this tragedy clearer than in the great noble houses. When Charlemagne's vast empire was divided among his grandsons under the Treaty of Verdun in 843, the Carolingian world, once unified under one emperor, splintered into three competing realms. In time, these divisions hardened into what would become France, Germany, and Italy. A law meant to preserve family harmony reshaped the map of Europe and condemned it to centuries of conflict. The same pattern played out on smaller scales across the continent. A baron's death could mean the carving of his manor into slivers, one son receiving the hall, another the farmlands, another the mill. The next generation divided it again. Within 3 generations, a single estate could spawn a dozen feuding cousins, each claiming the right to rule, none with the power to enforce it. The land, once united, became a web of jealous micro-lords locked in endless petty wars. Partible inheritance also poisoned family bonds. Every division was a negotiation, and every negotiation a potential betrayal. Brothers measured each other's worth in acres and cattle. Mothers wept as sons argued over grain stores. Some families attempted to avoid conflict by forcing one son into the clergy or knighthood, effectively removing him from the inheritance line. But that too came at a price. Priests could not pass property to heirs, and soldiers often died before producing one. Balance was impossible. The church and crown watched this chaos unfold with quiet satisfaction. Divided nobles were easier to control. Small lords, stripped of their unity, could not challenge royal authority or resist taxation. Kings encouraged primogeniture as a means of centralizing power, while the church continued to absorb the lands of those too weak to defend them. What began as a family affair became a political strategy. A divided estate was a subdued estate. Still, in the minds of many peasants and small landholders, the idea of equality persisted. A father's love could not be measured in legal codes. Even knowing the dangers, countless men continued to divide their holdings among their children, hoping to be remembered as fair, even if their decision doomed their descendants to poverty. For them, inheritance was not about ambition, but morality. To favor one child over another was to commit sin, yet the medieval world was never kind to fairness. The soil could not multiply to match human desire. Every generation reduced wealth and power further until once great families vanished entirely, absorbed by neighbors or consumed by debt. Castles became ruins, surnames disappeared from chronicles. The curse of the divided estate wasn't war or famine, but slow decay, one partition at a time. By the late Middle Ages, Europe learned a bitter lesson. The law of inheritance could never satisfy both justice and survival. To give equally was to destroy. To favor one was to betray. Between these two evils lay the fate of every family, every village, every kingdom. In a world built on land, the question was never who would rule. It was who would still have enough land left to rule at all. Not everyone fit neatly into the laws of inheritance. Beneath the noble families and royal decrees lay those who slipped through the cracks, the orphans, the widows, and the disinherited. They were the forgotten heirs of the medieval world, trapped in a system that valued land more than love and bloodlines more than humanity. Their stories reveal a darker truth. Inheritance in the Middle Ages was not a safeguard of family. It was a weapon of power. For widows, the moment of their husband's death was often the moment their struggle began. In most of Europe, a wife did not truly own her property. What she used by her husband's permission. When he died, everything, the land, the livestock, the dowry, reverted to his male heir. If she was fortunate, she might retain a dower, a small portion of land meant to sustain her until death. If she was unlucky, even that could be denied. Many widows were forced into remarriage by their husbands' relatives, not out of love, but necessity. A woman alone, without property, was seen as both vulnerable and dangerous, a loose thread in the fabric of inheritance. Some fought back. The chronicles of the 13th and 14th centuries are filled with widows who dragged lords and cousins before manorial courts, brandishing tattered parchments and swearing oaths to reclaim what was theirs. A few even won. Most did not. The law was written by men, enforced by men, and designed to protect the flow of land through male bloodlines. A widow's right existed only so long as it served someone else's interests. Orphans fared no better. A child who lost his parents also lost control over his future. Lords claimed guardianship over orphaned heirs, promising to protect them until they came of age. But protection often meant exploitation. The guardian controlled the estate's income, arranged the orphan's marriage, and in many cases sold the rights to the inheritance to another noble for profit. A wealthy orphan was not a blessing. It was a prize. If the orphan was a girl, her fate was almost always sealed by marriage. At 12 or 13, she could be promised to a man 3 times her age in exchange for political favor or financial debt. The law saw her not as a person, but as a vessel through which property could change hands. Inheritance was not just passed down. It was traded, disguised as matrimony. Then there were the disinherited, those cut out of inheritance entirely. A father could disown a son for defiance, a daughter for scandal, or a relative for siding with the wrong lord. To be disinherited was to become a ghost in one's own lifetime. The Church offered no salvation for such cases. Divine law followed human law too closely. These exiles filled Europe's roads and taverns, landless knights, illegitimate heirs, and castaway widows wandering between wars. Many joined mercenary bands or fled into monasteries. Some became legends, heroes or villains, but most were simply erased. For peasants, inheritance was even more fragile. Land was tied to service. To inherit a field was to inherit the obligation to work it. A poor harvest or unpaid rent could strip a family of everything. In some villages, families sold their inheritance rights for a handful of coins, surrendering their future to survive the present. The land remembered its owners, but the owners often had no say in who remembered them. The medieval world believed inheritance reflected divine order, yet its victims told another story. Every will written in ink left trails of suffering written in silence. For every castle that stayed in one family for generations, 100 nameless heirs lost theirs forever. To inherit was not just to receive, it was to survive a system designed to forget. In the grand halls of kings and the muddy lanes of peasants, one truth bound all alike. The law of inheritance protected the powerful, not the rightful. The widows prayed, the orphans waited, and the disinherited faded into history's shadows. Proof that in the Middle Ages, The most precious inheritance of all was not land nor gold, but mercy itself. Wherever there were laws, there were those who bent them. In the Middle Ages, inheritance was not only a family affair, it was a business, an industry of manipulation run by lawyers, clerics, and those who knew how to twist the written word into a weapon. While knights fought on battlefields for land, these men waged quieter wars across parchment and ink, deciding who would inherit and who would disappear from the record entirely. The medieval lawyer was not the impartial servant of justice we imagine today. He was a negotiator, a schemer, and often an opportunist. The language of law was Latin, a tongue the common people did not understand. So legal documents were shrouded in mystery. A single phrase could determine the fate of generations. A missing seal could undo a dynasty, and those who understood this arcane craft wielded more power than any sword. Many of these manipulators came from the church. Monks and clerics, trained to read and write, were the record keepers of Europe. They drafted wills, authenticated charters, and witnessed oaths. But their loyalty was rarely neutral. A priest could rewrite a dying man's testament in favor of a monastery. A bishop could declare a marriage invalid, stripping heirs of legitimacy. Inheritance was not just about the land, it was about the pen. And in the Middle Ages, the pen was owned by the church. Corruption was not subtle. In some towns, inheritance disputes turned into bidding wars. The side with more gold or influence could persuade clerks to produce new copies of lost documents, or destroy the originals. Even seals, supposedly sacred symbols of truth, were duplicated or forged. Families fought for years over charters that had been doctored in monasteries or rewritten under pressure from powerful patrons. Royal officials were no better. The crown had the final say in feudal succession, and kings often used inheritance claims to strengthen their control. If a noble family fell out of favor, their estates could be seized under the guise of unsettled succession. The property would then be granted to another loyal supporter. Every time a noble died without a clear heir, or with too many heirs, the king's treasury grew richer. Feudal law became a convenient mask for royal ambition. Beneath this surface of legality, a darker network operated, the shadow brokers of inheritance. These were the clerks, lawyers, and notaries who traded information, whispered secrets, and arranged quiet deals in taverns and monasteries. For a price, they could delay a court ruling, produce missing documents, or arrange marriages that conveniently shifted land from one house to another. Some even specialized in inheritance sabotage, finding legal loopholes to render a rival's claim invalid. For the families trapped in this web, inheritance became a game of patience and deceit. Noble heirs spent years in court, their fortunes draining away while scribes debated the wording of their ancestors' wills. The peasants fared worse. They had no access to legal defense at all. A lord's word, or a forged document blessed by a priest, was enough to erase generations of ownership. The church justified this corruption as divine justice. The crown called it feudal order. But for those beneath them, it was tyranny written in Latin. People began to fear paper more than swords. A man could defend his home from raiders, but not from a forged decree bearing a royal seal. Power had shifted. Violence no longer required bloodshed. It required ink. By the late Middle Ages, entire careers were built on managing inheritance disputes. The legal profession grew fat on confusion, and manipulation became routine. Every family with land feared not just death, but paperwork. The laws of inheritance, created to preserve order, had instead created a new class of predators, men who fed not on soil, but on signatures. And so, in a world where a single word could erase a legacy, the true inheritors were not the sons of lords or the widows of knights. They were the clerics and lawyers who ruled from behind the desk, shaping the fate of Europe one forged document at a time. The medieval world may have vanished in stone and dust, but its laws still echo through the modern age. Every will written today, every estate transferred, every family dispute over inheritance, each carries the shadow of a system forged 1,000 years ago when parchment and power were indistinguishable. The strange laws that governed life and death in the Middle Ages did not simply disappear. They evolved, embedding themselves quietly into the fabric of modern civilization. The principle of primogeniture, though largely abandoned, still lingers in noble titles and monarchies. Even now, some European crowns pass only to the eldest child, a remnant of that ancient obsession with unbroken bloodlines. The very idea that lineage and legitimacy define worth was born in the feudal courts of medieval lords. To be of noble blood was once a legal category. Today, it's cultural memory, but one that still divides societies in subtle ways. The Church's influence, too, survives in the idea that property and morality are connected. The medieval belief that wealth could purchase salvation became, over time, the notion of charitable giving and legacy donations. When people today leave fortunes to churches, universities, or hospitals in their name, they echo the same fear that haunted their ancestors, the desire to be remembered, to buy a piece of eternity through generosity. The tombs are gone, but the psychology remains. Modern legal systems still bear medieval fingerprints. The concept of a last will and testament, written and witnessed, was perfected in the Middle Ages. The Latin terms, executor, testator, beneficiary, all descend from ecclesiastical law. Even the act of sealing documents, now replaced by signatures, was once a sacred ritual believed to bind souls as well as property. The courtroom battles of medieval heirs became the civil suits of modern families. The language of the law changed. The human conflicts did not. And though the Church no longer dictates inheritance, other powers have taken its place. Governments tax estates, regulate property, and determine who receives what when a person dies. The mechanism is bureaucratic now, not spiritual, but its essence is the same. The state, like the medieval crown, still claims a portion of the dead. The promise of ownership remains an illusion. What we hold only until death, when it must return to the system that granted it. Culturally, the medieval obsession with lineage still defines how we think about family. We trace ancestry, preserve surnames, guard family homes, and speak of bloodlines as though they were sacred. Inheritance no longer means a patch of land. It means identity. Yet the old tensions persist. Families still fracture over wills. The wealthy still use lawyers to secure dynasties. And somewhere, someone still wonders whether the law serves justice, or simply those who can afford to write it. Perhaps the greatest inheritance of all from the medieval world is the moral one, the uneasy relationship between fairness and power. The same question that haunted the peasants of the 13th century haunts us still. What does it mean to deserve something? Inheritance has always been a paradox, a gift one did not earn, yet fiercely defended as one's right. The Middle Ages did not invent greed, but it gave greed legitimacy. It turned possession into destiny. As we look back across the centuries, at the forged wills, the manipulated laws, the widows who fought, and the orphans who lost, it becomes clear that the story of medieval inheritance is not about kings or castles at all. It is about us, about how humanity measures worth, how we define legacy, and how we struggle to make justice out of mortality. The ink may have faded from the parchments, the seals long cracked, but their meaning endures. Every law of inheritance is a reflection of fear, the fear of being forgotten. And just like the nobles and peasants of old, we still cling to the same hope, that what we leave behind will outlive us, and that our names, like theirs, will not vanish with the dust.